It was a quiet afternoon in the heart of a bustling city when something unimaginable unfolded, something that would shake the community to its core and ignite a conversation across the nation. On this particular day, an elderly black woman named Miss Eleanor, known for her warm smile and kind words to everyone in her neighborhood, found herself at the center of a storm she never saw coming. Eleanor was no stranger to the streets she had walked for decades, her presence a constant comfort to the community. She had spent her life as a teacher, shaping young minds, and in retirement, she became a beloved figure who volunteered at local shelters and advocated for the underserved. To many, she was more than just a neighbor. She was a symbol of resilience and hope. But on this day, the familiar comfort of Eleanor's neighborhood shattered when a pair of police officers pulled up in a patrol car. Officers Adams and Miller, both young and new to the force, carried themselves with a sense of authority, though their demeanor hinted at inexperience. What began as a routine patrol escalated into a moment that would define their careers and leave lasting scars on the community. Eleanor had been on her way home from the corner store, carrying a small bag of groceries. She always walked a bit slower these days, her gait measured and deliberate, a testament to her age. As she crossed the street, she noticed the patrol car pull over, its lights flashing, though there was no visible commotion. Confused but calm, she paused as the officers approached her. "Ma'am, we need to ask you some questions," Officer Adams said, his tone firm but not aggressive. Eleanor, ever polite, responded, "Of course, officers. How can I help you?" What happened next was nothing short of shocking. The officers claimed they had received a report about suspicious activity in the area, a description that, according to them, matched Eleanor. The accusation seemed absurd to anyone who knew her, but to the officers, protocol came first. Despite her calm demeanor and clear explanations about her whereabouts, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. Without substantial evidence or a real reason, the officers decided to detain her, citing vague suspicions. As Eleanor tried to explain, her voice filled with a mix of confusion and quiet dignity, the scene began to draw attention. Neighbors peeked out of their windows and stepped onto their porches, their faces reflecting disbelief. Phones emerged as bystanders began recording what they knew was an unjustified arrest. Eleanor's groceries spilled onto the pavement as the officers placed her in handcuffs, her frail wrists barely able to support the weight. The sight was heartbreaking. A respected elder treated like a common criminal, her dignity stripped away in an instant. The community's outrage was immediate. Whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs grew into shouts as people demanded to know why this was happening. "That's Miss Eleanor," someone yelled. "She wouldn't hurt a fly." Others joined in, their voices a chorus of anger and disbelief. But the officers, seemingly unaffected, escorted Eleanor to their patrol car, leaving her groceries scattered on the ground. As the patrol car drove away, the community was left stunned and seething. People exchanged worried glances, their minds racing with questions. How could this happen? Why was Eleanor targeted? And what would happen to her now? The air was thick with tension, and it was clear that this incident was far from over. What the officers didn't realize was that their actions were about to spark something much larger than they could have imagined. In the age of social media and instant communication, the footage captured by the bystanders would soon go viral, thrusting this small neighborhood into the national spotlight. Within hours, hashtags began trending, news outlets picked up the story, and the call for justice grew louder. As the video spread, so did the outrage. Activists, legal experts, and even public officials began weighing in, demanding answers and accountability. The arrest of Miss Eleanor was no longer just a local issue. It had become a symbol of something far greater: the urgent need for justice, fairness, and the re-examination of systemic issues that had plagued the community for far too long. And yet, as the world watched, one question lingered. What would happen to Eleanor? The story was just beginning, and the consequences of this fateful encounter would unfold in ways no one could have anticipated. But for now, one thing was clear: This wasn't just a mistake, it was a turning point. Stay tuned to find out how Miss Eleanor's story unraveled, the consequences faced by the officers, and the unexpected impact this moment had on everyone involved. The patrol car carrying Miss Eleanor disappeared around the corner, leaving the neighborhood in stunned silence. The people who had gathered outside stood motionless for a moment, their eyes fixed on the empty street as if hoping she might suddenly reappear. But deep down, they knew this wasn't going to be resolved quickly. A woman who had been nothing but a source of kindness and warmth was gone, taken away in handcuffs, and no one could make sense of it. Back at the corner store, the owner, Mr. Potol, was still in shock. He had known Eleanor for years. She came by every week to pick up a few essentials and chat about life. Just minutes before the officers arrived, they had shared a conversation about her upcoming plans to bake pies for a local fundraiser. He couldn't believe that anyone would think of her as suspicious. Determined to help, he reviewed his security camera footage, knowing it might hold the truth about her movements. As he replayed the video, he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. There was nothing unusual about Eleanor's visit, just a simple transaction and a warm smile as she left. Meanwhile, the community buzzed with activity. People gathered in small groups, speculating about what had happened. Some called friends and family to share the shocking news, while others posted on social media, urging others to speak out. Within hours, the footage captured by bystanders had spread far beyond the neighborhood, drawing attention from people who had never even heard of Miss Eleanor before. The videos showed everything: Eleanor's calm composure, the officer's insistence, the spilled groceries on the ground. But what stood out most was the look on her face, a mix of confusion, hurt, and quiet defiance. At the police station, Eleanor sat in a stark, cold room. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting a harsh glare on the metallic table in front of her. She wasn't angry, she was disappointed. She had seen injustice before, of course. She had lived through times when such treatment was all too common. But she had hoped things had changed, that people had learned to see one another as human beings. She clasped her hands together, her fingers trembling slightly as she thought about the kids she used to teach. What kind of example was this setting for them? Officer Adams, pacing in another room, began to feel the weight of what had just happened. He had been trained to follow protocol, to act decisively in uncertain situations. But something about this didn't sit right with him. The elderly woman they had just arrested didn't fit the profile of a threat. She was calm, polite, cooperative, and yet he had followed through with the arrest. Was it pride? Pressure to perform? He wasn't sure, but the uneasy feeling in his chest refused to go away. Miller, on the other hand, didn't seem as conflicted. "We did what we were supposed to do," he said, leaning back in his chair. The report matched her description. End of story. But Adams wasn't convinced. Something about Miller's casual dismissal made him question everything. Was it really that simple? Or were they missing something deeper? He couldn't shake the image of Eleanor's face as they led her to the car. It wasn't anger or fear. It was disappointment, as though she had expected better from them. Back in the neighborhood, Eleanor's closest friend, Mrs. Jenkins, was already on the phone with a local activist group. Mrs. Jenkins was a force to be reckoned with, sharp, determined, and unafraid to speak her mind. "This is an outrage," she told the person on the other end of the line. "You know Eleanor. You know she would never do anything to deserve this." The activist promised to help, and within hours, plans for a peaceful protest were in motion. Flyers were printed, calls were made, and the community began to mobilize. As night fell, the neighborhood was alive with activity. People knocked on doors, shared the news, and prepared signs for the protest. The sense of unity was palpable. This wasn't just about Eleanor anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been wrongfully accused, everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin or the biases of others. It was about standing up and saying enough. Meanwhile, the video footage continued to spread online. It reached local news stations first, then larger outlets. Journalists began digging into the story, trying to uncover the details. Who was Miss Eleanor? Why had she been arrested? And most importantly, what would happen next? Interviews with neighbors painted a clear picture. Eleanor was a pillar of the community, a woman who had dedicated her life to helping others. The contrast between this image and the scene in the videos was striking, and it only fueled the outrage. By morning, the hashtag Justice for Elena was trending nationwide. People from all walks of life weighed in, sharing their own stories of injustice and calling for accountability. Celebrities tweeted their support, politicians made statements, and legal experts began analyzing the footage. The pressure on the police department was mounting, and the chief knew they couldn't ignore this. Inside the station, Adams finally decided to speak up. "I think we made a mistake," he admitted to Miller. Miller scoffed, brushing him off. "Don't start second-guessing now. We did what we had to do." But Adams couldn't let it go. He approached their supervisor and explained his concerns, sharing his doubts about the legitimacy of the arrest. The supervisor listened carefully, his expression unreadable. "I'll look into it," he said, though his tone offered little reassurance. Eleanor, still sitting in the holding room, remained calm. She had always believed in the power of truth and patience, but she also knew that sometimes you had to fight for what was right. She thought of her late husband, who had marched for civil rights decades ago. He had always told her, "Never let them take your dignity, no matter what." And she hadn't. Even as she sat in that cold, sterile room, she held her head high, knowing she had done nothing wrong. Outside the station, a small crowd had gathered. It wasn't the full protest yet, just a handful of neighbors and friends who couldn't bear to go home without answers. They held up signs that read, "Free Miss Eleanor" and "Justice for all." Their voices were calm but firm, their presence a quiet reminder that the world was watching. As the hours passed, the tension grew. Inside the station, the officers and supervisors debated their next steps. Outside, the crowd swelled, and the online conversation showed no signs of slowing down. The stakes were rising, and everyone knew it. This wasn't just about one arrest anymore. It was about accountability, justice, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. But what would happen next? Would the department admit its mistake? Would Eleanor be released? Or would this turn into yet another story of injustice swept under the rug? As the sun rose over the city, casting its first light on the growing crowd outside, one thing was clear: this was far from over. The consequences of that fateful decision were just beginning to unfold. The crowd outside the police station grew larger by the hour, their quiet determination slowly turning into a powerful force of solidarity. People from neighboring communities arrived, some holding signs, others bringing water and snacks for those who had been there all night. It wasn't just Miss Eleanor's immediate neighbors anymore. It was strangers who had seen the video online, activists who had heard about the injustice, and even local clergy who wanted to show their support. The crowd was diverse in every way, united by a shared belief that what had happened to Eleanor was wrong and could not be ignored. Inside the station, tensions were running high. Officer Adams sat at his desk, replaying the events of the previous day in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Eleanor's calm but deeply disappointed face. He thought about how she hadn't resisted, hadn't raised her voice, even as they placed her in handcuffs. It wasn't the face of someone who was guilty of anything. He glanced at Miller, who was chatting casually with another officer, seemingly unaffected by the growing unrest outside. Adams couldn't understand how Miller could brush it off so easily. To Adams, this wasn't just a public relations problem, it was a question of right and wrong. In another part of the city, Miss Eleanor's granddaughter, Maya, sat in her apartment, scrolling through her phone. Maya was in her late 20s, a young lawyer who had always looked up to her grandmother. When she saw the first video of the arrest, she couldn't believe it. She had called her grandmother's phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. Maya felt a mix of emotions: anger, fear, and a deep sense of helplessness. But as she read the comments on the videos and saw the outpouring of support for Eleanor, she realized she couldn't sit idly by. This was bigger than her family now, and she needed to act. Maya quickly called her boss, a senior attorney at a well-known civil rights firm. "We have to take this case," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Her boss agreed, and within hours, Maya was on her way to the police station, armed with legal documents and a firm determination to get her grandmother released. She wasn't just fighting for Eleanor, she was fighting for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly by the system. Back at the station, the chief of police, Chief Ramirez, watched the situation unfold with growing concern. Ramirez was a seasoned officer who had spent decades on the force, and she prided herself on running a department that served the community fairly. But now her department was under a microscope, and the actions of two young officers threatened to undo years of hard work. She had spent the morning reviewing the footage of the arrest, as well as statements from Adams and Miller. Something about the situation didn't sit right with her. Ramirez knew she had to tread carefully. On one hand, she couldn't appear weak in front of her officers or the public. On the other hand, she couldn't ignore the growing evidence that this arrest had been a mistake. Meanwhile, in the holding room, Eleanor sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't afraid. She had lived through too much in her life to let fear take hold now. But she was tired, both physically and emotionally. She thought about her late husband, her children, and her granddaughter Maya. She knew they would be fighting for her, and that gave her strength. She also thought about the community she had loved and served for so many years. They were counting on her to stay strong, not just for herself, but for everyone who believed in justice and fairness. As the hours ticked by, the protest outside the station reached a fever pitch. People chanted Eleanor's name, calling for her release. Local news crews arrived, their cameras capturing the raw emotion of the crowd. Reporters interviewed neighbors, activists, and even passers-by who had been drawn in by the commotion. The narrative was clear. Eleanor was a beloved figure, a woman whose life had been dedicated to helping others. The idea that she could be accused of anything suspicious was absurd to anyone who knew her. But not everyone in the crowd was there to support Eleanor. A few individuals had shown up to defend the officers, arguing that they were just doing their jobs. These voices were in the minority, but they added an edge to the atmosphere. Tensions between the two groups threatened to boil over, and police officers stationed outside kept a watchful eye, ready to intervene if things got out of hand. Inside, Maya finally arrived, her presence like a storm sweeping through the building. She demanded to see her grandmother, her voice steady but filled with emotion. At first, the officers tried to give her the runaround, but Maya wasn't having it. She presented her credentials and made it clear that she wasn't leaving until Eleanor was released. Eventually, Ramirez intervened, agreeing to let Maya meet with her grandmother in a private room. When Eleanor saw Maya, her eyes filled with tears for the first time since the arrest. "Oh, Maya," she said softly, her voice trembling. Maya hugged her tightly, feeling the weight of everything her grandmother had endured. "Don't worry, Grandma," Maya said. "We're going to get you out of here, and we're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else." The meeting was brief, but it gave Eleanor a renewed sense of hope. She could see the fire in Maya's eyes, the determination that reminded her so much of her late husband. As Maya left the room, she turned to Ramirez. "This isn't just about my grandmother," she said. "This is about accountability. It's about making sure your officers understand the impact of their actions. I hope you're ready for what's coming." Ramirez didn't respond, but her expression was serious. She knew Maya was right. This was about more than just one arrest. It was about the trust between the police and the community, a trust that had been severely damaged. Ramirez returned to her office and began drafting a plan. She needed to act quickly, but she also needed to act carefully. Every decision she made from this point forward would be scrutinized, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Outside, the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the crowd. The energy was still high, but exhaustion was starting to set in for some. Yet no one wanted to leave. This wasn't just a protest. It was a vigil for a woman who had given so much to her community and now found herself in the fight of her life. As night fell, candles were lit, their warm glow a stark contrast to the cold steel of the police station. Adams, still sitting at his desk, finally made a decision. He couldn't stay silent any longer. He approached Ramirez, his heart pounding. "Chief," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I need to tell you something. I think we made a mistake, and I think we need to make it right." Ramirez looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Go on," she said. Adams took a deep breath and began to explain, knowing that his words could change everything. As the night wore on, the crowd outside remained steadfast, their voices echoing through the city. Inside, decisions were being made that would have far-reaching consequences. The story of Miss Eleanor was far from over, and the tension in the air was almost palpable. Everyone, Eleanor, Maya, the officers, the protesters, was waiting for the next chapter to unfold, knowing that whatever happened next would shape the future in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The tension inside the police station was thick enough to cut with a knife. Chief Ramirez sat in her office, staring at the stack of reports on her desk. The weight of the moment pressed down on her like never before. The accounts from her officers didn't align, and Adams' sudden willingness to speak up only deepened her concerns. She replayed his words in her mind. He had admitted to doubts about the arrest, but he hadn't given her the full story yet. Ramirez knew she needed to press in for more details, but she also needed to keep the situation outside from spiraling out of control. The crowd had grown even larger, their chants ringing through the night. The glow of candles mixed with the flashing blue and red lights of police cars, creating an eerie, surreal atmosphere. News vans were parked along the street, and journalists clamored for updates. Social media was ablaze with hashtags demanding justice for Eleanor. The city's leaders were starting to weigh in too, some issuing statements of support for Eleanor, while others called for calm and patience. The mayor had scheduled a press conference the following morning, but for many in the crowd, waiting wasn't an option. They wanted answers now. Maya stood at the front of the crowd, her face illuminated by the flickering light of a candle. She had just left a heated phone call with her firm, where she outlined the next steps for Eleanor's defense. But as determined as she was to fight this battle in court, she couldn't ignore the immediate need to get her grandmother out of that cell. Maya glanced at the station's entrance, her frustration mounting. What was taking so long? Why was it so hard for the system to admit when it was wrong? Inside, Adams sat across from Ramirez in her office. The young officer's hands were clasped tightly together, his knuckles white. He took a deep breath and began speaking. "Chief, I don't know how to say this, but I think we overstepped. Miss Eleanor wasn't doing anything wrong. We didn't have any solid reason to arrest her. It was just, Miller thought she looked suspicious and I went along with it. But now, seeing how everything has unfolded, I can't shake the feeling that we made a huge mistake." Ramirez leaned back in her chair, her face unreadable. "You went along with it?" she asked, her tone measured. Adams nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I didn't question him," he admitted. "I should have, but I didn't. And now it's blowing up in our faces." Ramirez let out a long sigh. She could see the sincerity in Adam's eyes, but sincerity wouldn't fix this mess. "Do you realize the position you've put this department in?" she asked. Adams nodded again, his expression heavy with regret. "I just want to make it right," he said softly. While Ramirez wrestled with how to handle Adams' admission, Maya was busy rallying the crowd outside. She spoke passionately, her voice cutting through the chants and murmurs. "This isn't just about my grandmother," she said, her words carrying weight. "This is about every single person who has been judged unfairly, every person who has been silenced, every person who has been denied justice. Tonight, we stand together, and we demand accountability. We won't be ignored." The crowd erupted in applause, their energy renewed by Maya's words. Even those who had been quietly observing from the sidelines felt compelled to join in. The solidarity was palpable, a reminder that this was bigger than any one person. Yet, amidst the unity, there was also an undercurrent of tension. A few heated arguments had broken out between supporters of Eleanor and those who defended the officer's actions. Police stationed outside were on high alert, ready to intervene if necessary. As midnight approached, the situation reached a boiling point. Inside the station, Ramirez called an emergency meeting with her senior staff. "We need to make a decision, and we need to make it now," she said, her voice firm. "The longer we wait, the worse it gets, for Eleanor, for the community, and for us." Her officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to say. Ramirez turned to Adams. "If you're willing to go on record about what happened, we might be able to salvage this," she said. Adams hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. "I'll do it," he finally said. "It's the least I can do." Anger. Maya tried to calm them down, urging them to remain peaceful, but the tension was undeniable. The line between frustration and action was becoming dangerously thin, and Maya knew they were running out of time. Inside, Ramirez prepared to make an announcement. She had spent hours reviewing the footage, consulting with her legal team, and grappling with the moral and professional implications of the situation. She knew that no decision would please everyone, but she also knew that doing nothing was no longer an option. As she stepped out of her office and headed toward the briefing room, she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Every step felt heavier than the last, each one bringing her closer to a decision that would shape the future of her department and her community. The air outside was electric, charged with the collective energy of hundreds of people demanding justice. The crowd quieted slightly as the station doors opened, their eyes fixed on Ramirez as she stepped out. She looked out at the sea of faces, her expressions somber. In her mind, she rehearsed the words she was about to say, knowing that each one carried immense significance. But as she opened her mouth to speak, a loud commotion erupted from the back of the crowd, drawing everyone's attention and adding another layer of suspense to an already tense night. The commotion at the back of the crowd drew everyone's attention like a magnet. Heads turned, murmurs rippled through the gathering, and the unified chants faltered into silence. The tension that had been simmering all evening felt like it had hit a new, unpredictable high. From her place at the front, Maya strained to see what was happening. All she could make out was a sudden flurry of movement, shadows shifting in the dim light. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with possibilities. Was it the police trying to break up the protest? Was someone in the crowd escalating things? Or was it something else entirely? At the heart of the commotion was an older man, his face weathered with age, but his posture upright and unyielding. He stepped forward, holding something tightly in his hand. People moved aside, creating a path for him, their whispers growing louder. Maya's breath caught when she recognized him. He was Reverend James, one of her grandmother's oldest friends and a prominent figure in the community. He had always been a voice of wisdom and calm in times of turmoil, and his unexpected presence sent a ripple of hope through the crowd. Reverend James held up a yellowed envelope, his voice steady but loud enough to carry. "I have something to say," he announced, his words cutting through the noise. The crowd quieted further, curiosity overtaking their agitation. Even Chief Ramirez, who had been poised to speak, stopped in her tracks, her gaze fixed on the Reverend. He walked forward, his steps deliberate, until he was standing just feet away from the police barricade. Maya rushed to his side, her face a mixture of relief and confusion. "Reverend, what's going on?" she whispered urgently. He gave her a reassuring look, but didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to address the crowd. "Many of you know Eleanor," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority and decades of experience. "You know the kind of person she is, but what you might not know is the story behind why she was in that park tonight." His words hung in the air, thick with implication. Maya's brow furrowed. What was he talking about? James opened the envelope and pulled out a photograph, holding it up for everyone to see. The picture, though slightly faded, clearly showed Eleanor as a young woman, standing in the same park where she had been arrested. She was surrounded by children, holding what looked like a banner, her smile radiant and full of purpose. This park wasn't just a random place for Eleanor, the Reverend explained. It was a place she fought to save decades ago when developers wanted to tear it down and turn it into a parking lot. She led the charge to keep it a green space for the community, organizing protests, gathering signatures, and even facing threats. That park is as much hers as it is the city's, maybe even more. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, their energy renewed. Maya felt a lump form in her throat. She had known her grandmother was involved in community activism, but this was a piece of history she had never heard before. It added a new layer to the injustice of her arrest, a deeper sense of wrong that ignited the crowd's anger and determination. Reverend James wasn't finished, though. Eleanor wasn't just sitting in that park tonight, he continued. She was there because she was planning to launch a new initiative to restore it. She had been working quietly for months, reaching out to donors and local leaders. Tonight was supposed to be the night she finalized her plans. The revelation hit Maya like a bolt of lightning. Her grandmother had been planning something good, something for the community, and instead of being celebrated, she had been thrown into a holding cell. Maya's jaw tightened, her resolve hardening. "This changes everything," she said, her voice low but fierce. "They need to know this." Inside the station, Ramirez was watching everything unfold from the window. The Reverend's words were echoing in her mind, and for the first time that night, she felt truly conflicted. The more she learned about Eleanor, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a case of bad judgment. It was a glaring mistake, one that could shatter the fragile trust between the police and the community. Adams, who was standing nearby, seemed equally shaken. "We have to fix this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ramirez didn't respond. She was already calculating her next move. As the Reverend finished speaking, a sudden movement at the edge of the crowd caught Maya's eye. A man in a dark jacket was trying to blend in, but something about him seemed off. He wasn't holding a candle or chanting. He was watching, observing, almost like he was waiting for something. Maya nudged the person next to her and pointed him out. "Do you know who that is?" she asked. The person shook their head, and Maya felt a chill run down her spine. She couldn't explain why, but she felt like he didn't belong there. Before she could say anything else, the man turned and disappeared into the darkness. Maya's instincts screamed at her to follow him, but she knew she couldn't leave the crowd, not with everything hanging in the balance. Instead, she made a mental note to keep an eye out for him. Something about this night felt bigger than even her grandmother's arrest, and Maya couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of uncovering something much larger. The tension in the air was almost unbearable as the crowd waited to see what would happen next. Ramirez stepped out of the station again, her expression unreadable. She glanced at the Reverend, then at Maya, and finally at the crowd. "I've heard you," she began, her voice steady but low. "And I've seen enough to know that mistakes were made tonight. But there's more we need to uncover before we can make things right." Her words were met with a mixture of cheers and skepticism. The crowd wasn't ready to settle for promises, they wanted action. But before anyone could respond, a loud, piercing noise cut through the night. It was coming from the direction of the station, a high-pitched alarm that sent officers scrambling. Ramirez's face darkened. "What now?" she muttered, turning back toward the building. The crowd surged forward, curiosity and fear mixing in equal measure. Something was happening, something that none of them could have anticipated, and it was about to change everything. The high-pitched alarm echoed through the night, freezing everyone in place. For a moment, it felt as though the world had stopped spinning. Officers were scrambling back toward the station, their radios crackling with frantic chatter. The crowd, now restless and on edge, surged closer to the barricades, their curiosity outweighing their fear. Maya stood at the forefront, her eyes darting between the chaos at the station and the Reverend beside her, who clutched the envelope tightly, as though it were a lifeline. Inside the station, Ramirez's voice rang out sharply as she barked orders at her team. "Find the source of that alarm now," she demanded, her authority cutting through the confusion. Adams was already halfway down the hallway, scanning the area for anything unusual. The alarm wasn't part of their usual security system, and that fact alone made it all the more unsettling. It was almost as if someone had triggered it intentionally. Back outside, Maya's heart raced as she watched the officers scramble. Something wasn't adding up. Why would a routine protest and arrest evolve into this level of chaos? Her mind flashed back to the man in the dark jacket, the one who didn't seem to belong. She couldn't shake the feeling that he had something to do with it. Turning to Reverend James, she whispered urgently, "Stay here. I need to check something." Before he could protest, she slipped into the shadows, determined to get closer to the station and find out what was going on. As she crept around the side of the building, her instincts were on high alert. The faint sound of footsteps ahead made her pause. Peering around the corner, she saw the same man from earlier, now crouched near a side door to the station. He was fiddling with something, some kind of device, and Maya's stomach dropped. She wasn't sure what he was up to, but it couldn't be good. Taking a deep breath, she pulled out her phone and started recording. If she couldn't stop him, she could at least gather evidence. Maya's pulse quickened. She waited a few seconds, then crept closer to the door. Pressing her ear against it, she could hear muffled voices, two men, arguing in hushed tones. She couldn't make out everything, but a few words stood out: files, evidence, and cover-up. Her breath caught. Was this about her grandmother's arrest, or was it something bigger? The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was far more sinister than she'd imagined. Back outside, the crowd had grown restless. Reverend James was doing his best to keep everyone calm, but the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Ramirez emerged from the station, her face a mask of frustration. "We're handling the situation," she told the crowd, but her words did little to ease their concerns. The murmurs grew louder, suspicion creeping into their voices. They had been burned too many times before to take her at her word. Inside, Maya was still listening at the door when she heard a loud crash. She jumped back, her heart pounding as the door burst open and the man from earlier stormed out, his face twisted with anger. He didn't see her as he rushed down the hallway and out of sight. Maya took a deep breath, then peeked into the room. It was empty, but the desk inside was covered in papers and folders, some of them scattered across the floor. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the mess for anything that might explain what was going on. One folder in particular caught her eye. It was marked with her grandmother's name and stamped with the words "confidential." Maya's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were documents and photos, some dating back decades. They detailed her grandmother's activism, but also something darker, evidence that certain city officials had been trying to discredit her for years. There were notes about surveillance, anonymous complaints, and even false charges that had been quietly dismissed. It was a systematic effort to silence her voice, and tonight's arrest was just the latest chapter. Maya's anger burned white-hot as she flipped through the pages. This wasn't just about her grandmother. It was about a system that had been targeting people like her for generations. She pulled out her phone and began taking pictures of the documents, determined to share the truth. But before she could finish, she heard footsteps approaching. Stuffing the folder into her bag, she slipped out of the room and back into the hallway, her heart racing. Outside, the tension reached a boiling point as the crowd began chanting again, louder and more unified than before. Ramirez looked over her shoulder at the station, worry etched on her face. She knew she was losing control of the situation, and the weight of that realization pressed down on her. But just as she was about to address the crowd again, Maya emerged from the side of the building, her face flushed with urgency. She climbed onto a makeshift platform and held up her phone. "I have proof," she called out, her voice strong and steady despite the chaos around her. The crowd fell silent, all eyes on her. This isn't just about my grandmother's arrest. This is about years of corruption and injustice. They've been trying to silence her because she speaks the truth, and tonight they went too far. The crowd erupted in cheers and shouts of support, their energy electrifying. Ramirez stepped forward, her expression unreadable. What proof? She asked, her voice laced with skepticism. Maya locked eyes with her and held up the folder. This, she said firmly, and it's just the beginning. Before Ramirez could respond, a voice from the back of the crowd called out. It was Eleanor, her presence as commanding as ever despite the events of the night. The officers who had detained her had quietly released her, unable to justify holding her any longer. She walked to the front, her head held high, and joined Maya on the platform. They can't silence us, she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of struggle. Not tonight, not ever. The crowd rode in agreement, their unity stronger than ever. But even as the victory felt within reach, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. Somewhere in the shadows, the man in the dark jacket was still out there, and she knew he wasn't finished yet. As the crowd's cheers filled the air, Eleanor stood tall next to Maya, her presence commanding and resolute. Maya held the folder tightly, its contents still fresh in her mind. This moment felt monumental, not just for her grandmother, but for the entire community that had gathered here tonight. The weight of history, of every injustice they had endured, hung in the air like a heavy fog. Yet, there was a glimmer of something else too, hope. It was faint but unmistakable, carried in the voices of those standing shoulder to shoulder, refusing to back down. I want to see what's in that folder, Ramirez finally said, her voice steady but not demanding. Maya hesitated, unsure whether she could trust the woman who had been part of the system that had wronged her grandmother. But Eleanor placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent reassurance that this was the right step. Slowly, Maya handed the folder over, her fingers brushing against the worn edges as if releasing a piece of herself. Ramirez flipped through the documents, her face tightening with each page she read. When she reached the final sheet, she closed the folder and looked up, her expression unreadable. "This is serious," she said quietly, addressing not just Maya, but the entire crowd. "If what's in here is true, then there will be an investigation, and I'll make sure it's thorough." The crowd murmured, their skepticism palpable. They had heard promises before, empty words meant to pacify rather than bring change. But there was something different about Ramirez now. Her usual commanding demeanor seemed to waver, replaced by a flicker of genuine concern. Maya wanted to believe her, but trust was a luxury she couldn't afford just yet. As the tension simmered, a voice rang out from the back of the crowd. "It's not just about an investigation. We need accountability." It was a young man, his face determined and his words echoing the sentiments of many. Others began to chime in, their voices overlapping in a chorus of demands. Maya felt a swell of pride as she realized the protest had transformed into something more, a movement. Eleanor stepped forward, raising her hands to calm the crowd. Her voice, though weathered by time, carried a strength that silenced the noise. "We fought for justice our whole lives," she began, her eyes sweeping over the sea of faces. "And tonight, we've shown them that we won't be silenced. But this is just the beginning. The real fight starts tomorrow, when we take this evidence to court, when we demand action, and when we hold them to their promises." The crowd erupted in applause, their energy renewed. For the first time in what felt like hours, Maya allowed herself to breathe. The weight of the night's events pressed heavily on her, but she felt a sense of purpose stronger than ever before. She looked at her grandmother, who was standing tall despite the toll the evening had taken. Eleanor's resilience was a beacon, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable adversity, the fight was worth it. As the crowd began to disperse, conversations buzzed about next steps, organizing meetings, gathering more evidence, reaching out to the press. Ramirez lingered for a moment, then approached Eleanor and Maya. "I don't know if I can fix everything," she admitted, her voice low. "But I'll do what I can. This can't be ignored anymore." Eleanor nodded, her expression unreadable. "It's not about what you can fix," she said. "It's about whether you're willing to stand on the right side of history. The rest will follow." Ramirez seemed to take the words to heart, nodding before retreating back into the station. The crowd had thinned significantly, leaving only a few stragglers and the glow of the streetlights. Maya turned to her grandmother, who was watching the scene unfold with a quiet intensity. "Do you think she meant it?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at Maya, her eyes filled with a mix of wariness and pride. "What matters is that we don't stop," she said. "Whether they mean it or not, we keep pushing. That's how change happens." Maya nodded, feeling the truth of her grandmother's words settle deep in her chest. As they began the walk home, the folder safely tucked under Maya's arm, she couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about Eleanor or even their family. It was about everyone who had been wronged by a system that was supposed to protect them. And while the road ahead would undoubtedly be long and difficult, Maya knew she was ready to walk it. In the days that followed, the momentum from that night didn't waver. The documents Maya had uncovered became the catalyst for a wave of investigations and public outcry. News outlets picked up the story, amplifying the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. The community rallied together, organizing marches and town hall meetings, each step a testament to their collective strength. Ramirez, true to her word, initiated an internal review within the police department. It wasn't perfect, and there were still plenty of skeptics, but it was a start. For the first time in years, there was a glimmer of accountability. Meanwhile, Eleanor continued to be a guiding force, her unwavering spirit inspiring others to join the cause. Maya, too, found her voice in the movement. She became a storyteller, using her platform to amplify the experiences of others and shed light on the injustices that had been hidden for so long. Each story she told, each truth she revealed, felt like a step toward healing, not just for her family, but for the entire community. Months later, as Maya stood in front of a packed auditorium, speaking to a crowd that had grown far beyond her neighborhood, she thought back to that night. It had been chaotic and terrifying, but it had also been the start of something beautiful. Change didn't happen overnight, and there was still so much work to be done. But as she looked out at the faces before her, young and old, black and white, all united by a shared determination, she felt a surge of hope. Eleanor sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap and a small, proud smile on her face. Maya's voice rang out strong and clear, each word a promise that their fight wasn't over. It was a promise to her grandmother, to her community, and to herself. Because in the end, justice wasn't just about one night or one arrest. It was about a lifetime of standing up, speaking out, and never backing down.